Before we get started, the chapter originally wrote down and it contains descriptions of child abuse of the worst possible kind and multiple other forms of abuse too, and the preparation for a murder. Now, I personally feel sick even reading these things. I often scroll past when I'm reading this particular chapter, but in order to make it more palatable for my listeners and self-indulgently for myself, I will be mostly replacing the words used with the word abuse, just to make this slightly easier to listen to and to say. So, just to give you guys a heads up, here we go. The Avengers vs. the Peter Factor by midnightwolf2192. Chapter 27, Maria Hill and Nick Fury. Nick Fury. He would never tell Stark this, but Nick Fury was actually the first Avenger, or Avenger adjacent, to meet Peter Parker, and he had met Peter Parker when the kid was still in nappies. You see, Peter was the son of Mary and Richard Parker, two former S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Fury had received the call from the hospital that Mary was in labour and Richard was needed by her side. He was the first non-family member to visit the Parkers in the hospital. Flashback. "Come in, Director," Richard said with a wide grin on his face as Nick knocked on the hospital room door. Nick followed the man into the room and quickly suppressed a grin. Mary was sitting up against the pillows, exhausted but glowing as she held a tiny blue bundle in her arms. "Hey, Fury," Mary said as she looked up at him. Nick approached the bed and stared down at the bundle in her arms. Richard returned to his wife's side and smiled down at her. "We'd like to introduce you to Peter Benjamin Parker." "Well, we'll turn him into an agent once he's walking," Nick teased, and Mary rolled her eyes. She leant forward and Nick tensed as the baby was moved into his arms. "What the heck are you doing?" "Giving you your first grandchild to hold," Mary teased, and Nick glared at her. The woman laughed softly and grinned cheekily. "Come on, we all know you think of us as your unruly children. Makes sense that you would be Peter's grandfather." "Just for that, I'll turn him into a spy," Nick retorted, and both Richard and Mary laughed. Nick looked down at the baby in his arms and allowed a smile to cross his face. "Welcome to the world, kid. It's a pretty bad place, but people like your parents are working hard to make it better." The baby opened his eyes, little blue orbs that Fury had no doubt would change into the brown of his parents before too long. Little Peter stared at the man holding him intently, and Nick would never admit, even under the pain of the worst torture, that Peter Parker had Director Nick Fury of S.H.I.E.L.D. wrapped firmly around his little finger. The next time Nick had laid eyes on Peter was when the boy was 4. He was standing between Benjamin and May Parker in a little black suit on his body. The Fury of Mary and Richard Parker had been attended by friends and family from all over America. Agents had requested leave to attend, and Nick was never going to deny them that. While mostly stared at the empty coffins, Nick observed the boy. Peter had sat the entire funeral in May's lap. He had been holding onto a small plush fox that had Nick smiling. He had been the one to gift that to Peter when he was a baby. Nick knew that Hydra had been behind the deaths of his 2 best agents, but no one else did. To the outside world, Mary and Richard had been killed when the plane they were travelling in went down. But Nick knew the truth, and if it killed him, he would spend the rest of his life avenging their deaths. The wake was held at the church hall, and during a moment of peace, Nick moved away from the large group of mourners and approached the small courtyard between the church and the hall. Benjamin Parker, Richard's brother, was standing at the gate watching Peter play quietly in the courtyard. The man turned his head and nodded at Fury as the other man approached. "How's the kid?" Fury asked, inclining his head towards Peter. "I don't think he completely understands things," Ben replied. "Maybe one day it will hit him, but for now I kind of appreciate that he is oblivious. He's strong, like them. He'll be okay," Fury said, and both men fell silent. "You know what happened, don't you?" Ben asked rhetorically, and Fury nodded. "Make them pay for what they did. Not just for what they did to my brother and sister-in-law, but mostly for what they did to Peter." "They will never know what hit them," Fury replied. He He shook Ben's hand and slipped a business card into it and gave Peter one last final look. The small boy was staring at him curiously, and Nick allowed a rare smile to cross his face as the boy waved at him. For the next 4 years, Nick Fury worked tirelessly to find the people who had orphaned his grandson. Yes, Nick had taken to calling Peter that in his head. He had given Ben the business card, and after the funeral had sent him a letter telling him to call if Peter or he ever needed help. He never expected that phone call to come, but one day it did, and it would forever remain in Nick's memory. Okay, here's the nasty stuff. Brace yourselves, people. Flashback. Nick was typing on his computer when his phone rang. He picked it up and grunted down the line. "I've got Benjamin Parker on the line for you, Director," Isabel, his secretary, said. At Fury's direction, the woman patched the call through. "What can I do for you, Mr. Parker?" Fury asked, and he was instantly on edge. Ben was breathing heavily down the line, and Fury frowned. "Parker, what's going on?" "He hurt my nephew," Ben hissed out, and Fury growled. "He flippin' hurt my boy, Fury, and I can't do a dang thing about it. He's under 18, so he'll get off lightly. I just know it." "What happened?" Fury's voice was short and sharp as he spoke, and he listened as Ben took a few deep breaths. Flip, Fury. "That monster abused my kid," Ben said, and Nick saw red. Someone had defiled Peter in the worst of ways. "We trusted him, and he hurt my boy." "Name," Fury demanded. Ben went silent, and Fury growled, "Give me his name." "Stephen Westcott, Skip," Ben replied. "I don't want to know. Just fix it." "Done," Fury replied before hanging up on the phone. Outside Director Fury's office, Isabel jumped in her seat at the sound of a mug smashing against the office floor pierced the air. Fury appeared in the doorway, and Isabel actually feared for the person who had put that look on her boss's face. "Get me Romanoff. Now!" Natasha Romanoff entered her boss's office with a raised eyebrow. To the untrained eye, Fury was calm and collected, but Natasha could see he was borderline apoplectic. She sat down across from him, and he slid a file over to her. "I want him to suffer," Nick said firmly. Natasha looked down at the file in front of her. 17-year-old Stephen Skip Westcott, currently held in county jail awaiting trial for child abuse and a host of other child abuse-related offences. Natasha looked up at Nick and nodded. She stood, taking the file with her, and left the office. End flashback. Westcott had never stood a chance. He had messed with the wrong child. Nick had intercepted a report from the New York County Jail that stated Stephen Westcott had died in the jail infirmary. The list of his injuries was as long as Fury's arm. Apparently, he had written a note confessing to all the charges against him, which had been found by some of the other inmates. They hadn't taken too kindly to finding a child abuser in their midst, and had taken matters into their own hands. How Skip had entered in the general population, given the nature of his crimes, the guards couldn't say. One of the prisoners had taken full responsibility, stating he was already being held for murder, so it was one more victim on his list. The next time Fury saw Peter Parker was on the landing pad in Wakanda. He hadn't had the chance to speak with the teenager, but he could see the boy was a spitting image of both his parents. A month after Peter had returned to Earth, Nick was working in his office when Isabel, his faithful assistant, even through all the Hydra nonsense, knocked on the door. "A Peter Parker to see you, sir?" Isabel said, and Nick nodded. The woman stepped aside, and the teenager walked in slowly. His flurkin was perched on his shoulder, and Nick rolled his eyes fondly. Goose meowed from her bed in the corner of his office, and Helix leapt off Peter's shoulder to join her. "What are you doing here, Parker?" Fury asked as the boy sat down across from him. The kid raised an eyebrow, and flip if he didn't look more like Richard than ever. He pulled out a manila folder from his bag. He placed it on the desk between them and slid it across to Nick. Opening it, Nick raised an eyebrow at the information within. "I know this was you," Peter said softly. The information contained in the folder pertained to Steve Westcott and his death. "Well, it was really Aunt Tasha, but I know that you had a hand in it." "And why would I play a role in the death of a child abuser?" Nick asked, and he grimaced internally as Peter flinched. "Sorry." It's okay, Peter replied. As to why? Because I know Uncle Ben called you. I might have been only 8 at the time, but I remember overhearing that conversation. Uncle Ben thought I was in my room, but I wanted some juice, so I snuck out to get some. I heard him on the phone to you. Kid, Nick tried to interject, but Peter shook his head. I always thought Skip was still in prison. Uncle Ben and Aunt May told me he would never hurt me or any other kid again, and I must have thought that he had confessed and been put away. I never really thought about him until recently, Peter explained. Why were you thinking about him? Nick asked curiously, and Peter sighed. Helix and Goose approached the teen and he sighed. The smaller Flurkin leapt into his master's lap. Goose rubbed herself against Peter's legs before climbing up to settle around the boy's neck. The anniversary is coming up, Peter admitted. I've blanked most of it from my mind, but the dates are always something I'll remember. I wanted to make sure he was still locked away, so imagine my surprise to find he was dead. What makes you think Romanoff and I had a hand in his death? This says here that he was killed by a fellow inmate, Nick asked, and at the look of incredulity Peter shot at him was all merry. You mean besides the fact that Skip was placed in general population of the jail despite the nature of his crime? Peter smirked and Fury smirked. You might not know this, Mr. Director Fury, sir, but not only am I smart, but my best friend is an expert hacker, and we have access to the smartest AI on the planet. We found that someone had edited Skip's information from outside the prison, and when we followed the trail, it led us back to S.H.I.E.L.D. Now, buried deep in the data dump from a few years ago was a file on Skip and a mission report indicating that Natasha Romanoff had been sent to New York County Jail around the time Skip died. Could be a coincidence, Nick replied. I know Aunt Tasha. Nothing is ever a coincidence where that woman is concerned, Peter said with a smile. The smile fell for a moment, his face turning serious as he stared at Fury. Why did he do it? Did you know I was the first person outside your immediate family to hold you as a baby? Nick fired back, answering his question with one of his own. Peter looked at him in confusion, and Nick nodded. You were only a few hours old, and your mum, pain in the butt as she was, handed you over to me with no preamble. You were this tiny little thing, quiet as a mouse, but curious. So it's true. My parents worked for S.H.I.E.L.D., Peter said, and Nick nodded. Your dad was one of our chief scientists, and your mum was one of the best agents we had. Nick replied. We had them working on a joint operation, which is where they met and fell in love. I miss them, Peter admitted softly, and Nick felt a surge of parental feeling rush through him. They loved you immensely, Parker. Can't imagine Mary would be impressed with your extracurricular activities, but Richard would love it. The scientist in him would be loving your skills and abilities, Nick replied fondly. He then sobered and fixed Peter with a look. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from Westcott. No one could have, Peter replied as Nick stood and crossed round his desk. But as bad as it is to admit, I'm glad he's dead. Aunt Tasha seemed to catch on quick that I had a vested interest in the case. She mentioned that you had authorised it. That's why I came here today. Kid, I couldn't protect your mum and dad, but I could avenge them. I couldn't protect you, so you better dang well believe I have avenged you just as I did them, Nick said, and Peter looked up at him. I have a few regrets in my life, but ordering that monster's death wasn't one of them. Peter moved the 2 Flurkins from his body, and Nick raised an eyebrow as the boy moved closer to him and hugged him. Nick allowed the boy to hug him, even going so far as to hug the boy back. After a minute, Nick pushed the kid away gently. All right, enough of the mushy stuff, Nick ordered, and Peter grinned. Tell anyone I was sentimental, and I'll end you, Parker. No, you wouldn't, Peter replied smartly, and Nick glared. Helix jumped off Peter's body and took his place on the teen's shoulder once again. Thank you for your time, Director Fury, sir. Get out of my office, Nick said with a fond smile. Peter saluted sarcastically, and after petting Goose on the head, he made his way to the door. Nick returned to his chair and raised an eyebrow as Peter paused in the door. What, Parker? Just a question, Peter said with a mischievous look in his eye. Is it true you can't eat toast if it's cut diagonally? I'll kill Danvers when I see her next. Fury hissed, and Peter's laughter echoed throughout the office as the team left. Fury grinned as he watched the kid go. He was the best parts of both his parents, and Fury would watch the world burn before he allowed Peter to be harmed again. The Peter factor 35, Avengers & Co. 0. Sorry if this got intense there, guys. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and hopefully make this channel grow. Bye!